The Woolwich Tragedy, a nation in shock true crime, real events, investigative documentary. The afternoon of May 22, 2013, was bright and ordinary in Woolwich, southeast London. It was the kind of weekday afternoon where schoolchildren headed home, buses hummed along busy roads, and people crossed the street with little thought to what might happen next. Among them was Lee Rigby, a 25-year-old British soldier. He wasn't in uniform that day, just a hoodie printed with the logo of Help for Heroes, a charity supporting wounded veterans. To most who saw him, he looked like any other Londoner. Few knew that behind that calm smile was a man who had faced the harshest realities of war, and who had survived them only to face tragedy where he least expected it, at home. Lee grew up in Middleton, Greater Manchester, and joined the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers at a young age. His friends described him as the life of the room, cheerful, loyal, and endlessly talkative. To his family, he was simply our boy. He served in Afghanistan as both a drummer and machine gunner, balancing the precision of music with the chaos of combat. When his tour ended, his family breathed a sigh of relief. After years abroad, he had finally been assigned to a safer role as an army recruiter in London. His stepfather later said, "He loved what he did. He believed in service. And we thought the worst was behind him." But on that May afternoon, the sense of safety his loved ones clung to would shatter forever. The routine that changed everything. At around 2 p.m., Lee had finished visiting his local recruiting office. He was heading back to the Royal Artillery Barracks, a short walk he'd made countless times before. He checked his phone, sent a quick text to his fiancée, and began crossing the road near John Wilson Street. Then came the sound of screeching tires. A blue Vauxhall Tigris suddenly swerved onto the pavement. It wasn't an accident. The car accelerated straight toward him. Witnesses later described the moment as instant chaos. The vehicle struck Lee with brutal force, dragging him several feet before crashing into a road sign. The impact knocked him unconscious. People on the street gasped, unsure of what they had just seen. Within seconds, two men stepped out of the wrecked car, both calm, both armed. The unthinkable unfolds. They were Michael Adebolajo, 28, and Michael Adebowale, 22, men who had grown up in London, once ordinary citizens now consumed by radical beliefs. What followed was an act so shocking it froze an entire nation. But what happened in Woolwich that day is not just a crime story, it is a story about how ordinary people respond when the unthinkable happens before their eyes. As confusion spread, a woman named Ingrid Lyo-Kennett, a mother and former teacher, got off a nearby bus. She thought there had been a car crash and ran forward to help. When she saw Lee lying motionless on the ground, she tried to render aid, until she noticed the weapons in the hands of the men standing beside him. Still, Ingrid did not run. Instead, she started talking. She later said, "If I could keep them focused on me, maybe they wouldn't hurt anyone else." Her courage was astonishing. With people screaming in the background, traffic frozen, and phones recording, she looked into the eyes of the men and asked them to put down their weapons. They didn't. One of them began speaking, not shouting, but addressing her directly, as though delivering a message. He said, "I killed him because he killed Muslims abroad." He insisted that what they had done was not random. He called it retaliation, a twisted justification for an unspeakable act. Still, Ingrid kept her composure. "You did this," she said quietly. "But now, you must let it end here." Heroes in the crowd. While she talked to the men, two other women stepped forward, Amanda Donnelly and her teenage daughter Gemini. They crossed the road, ignoring the danger, and knelt beside Lee. Amanda took off her coat and draped it over him, while Gemini spoke softly to the fallen soldier. "I wanted him to know someone cared," she later said. It was an act of compassion that became one of the defining images of that day. Three women facing horror, responding not with hatred or fear, but with humanity. The moment that shocked a nation. Police calls flooded in. People recorded on their phones, frozen in disbelief. The attackers, disturbingly composed, told bystanders to call the authorities themselves. They waited. They wanted to be seen. By the time armed police units arrived minutes later, the men were still at the scene. Witnesses said they appeared ready, almost expecting confrontation. As officers stepped out of their vehicles, the suspects advanced, shouting at them, one raising what looked like a firearm. The police responded with measured force, shooting both men in the legs and arms to disarm them. Within moments, the chaos ended. Paramedics rushed in, first to the suspects, then to Lee. But it was too late. That afternoon, London changed. The footage, the bravery, the sheer disbelief of it all. It would haunt the city and the country for years. And as investigators began piecing together who these men were and what had led them here, one question echoed through the streets of Woolwich and the halls of Parliament alike. How could something like this happen, in broad daylight on a London street, to one of their own? In the hours after the Woolwich tragedy, the streets of southeast London were cordoned off with blue tape and heavy silence. The bright afternoon had turned to grey, and a light drizzle began to fall as police and forensic teams worked into the evening. The scene was a blur of flashing lights, dazed witnesses, and the quiet, relentless clicking of cameras documenting what had just happened. What the public saw on the news that night, the aftermath of the attack and the faces of the two men responsible, sparked disbelief, outrage, and confusion across the entire United Kingdom. How could two young men, born and raised in London, turn their rage so violently against one of their own countrymen? To understand what had happened on that street, investigators had to go back, years back, to uncover what turned Michael Adebolejo and Michael Adebowale from ordinary citizens into symbols of something far darker. The first name, Michael Adebolejo. Born in December 1984, Michael Adebolejo was raised in Romford, East London, in a warm, church-going family. His parents were devout Christians, loving, strict, and hardworking. Those who knew him as a boy described him as polite, quiet, and academically average. There was nothing unusual about him until he reached his late teens. At 18 years old, Adebolejo converted to Islam. At first, it appeared to be a peaceful personal journey. He attended mosque, learned Arabic, and surrounded himself with new friends. But something changed over the next few years. He began attending meetings with known radical preachers and groups that had already caught the attention of MI5, Britain's domestic intelligence agency. Adebolejo was charismatic, vocal, and easily influenced by extremist rhetoric that framed Western intervention abroad as an attack on Muslims. By the late 2000s, he was openly associating with Anjem Choudary, a well-known extremist figure in the UK. Authorities watched him, but he never crossed a legal line until 2010, when Adebolejo traveled to Kenya, allegedly trying to join a terrorist organization linked to Al-Shabaab. Kenyan anti-terror police arrested him near the border, and he later claimed he was detained and mistreated before being deported back to the UK. The event deeply affected him, not just emotionally, but ideologically. Back in London, MI5 questioned him about his trip and even tried to recruit him as an informant. He refused. Friends would later say this encounter hardened his hatred toward the British government. Adebolejo believed the system had turned him into a target, and that conviction began to shape everything he would do next. The second name, Michael Adebowale. The younger of the two, Michael Adebowale, had a different path, one marked by instability and mental struggle. Born in 1992 in Greenwich, London, he grew up mainly with his mother, who worked as a probation officer. His father, a Nigerian diplomat, separated from the family early on. At 16, Adebowale experienced a violent attack that would change his life. He was stabbed during a street fight in which another young man was killed right in front of him. Friends later said he suffered nightmares and paranoia afterward, a trauma that never really left him. By 17, Adebowale had converted to Islam. At first, he appeared calm and thoughtful, but soon, like Adebolejo, he became involved in extremist circles. These meetings gave him something he lacked: belonging, purpose, identity. But unlike Adebolejo, who was driven by ideology, Adebowale's path was clouded by mental illness and drug use. Family members noticed he had become withdrawn and erratic. His mother sought help multiple times, fearing he was losing touch with reality. Medical reports later confirmed he experienced psychotic episodes, sometimes worsened by substance use. By 2012, he was already known to MI5. Incredibly, That December, Adebowale sent an online message to a man overseas asking how to kill a soldier, a detail that British intelligence would only uncover after the Woolwich attack. Both men, living in different parts of London but connected by ideology, found one another through the same radical network. Their friendship would eventually bring them to Woolwich on that May afternoon, a moment neither law enforcement nor the country would ever forget. A system under scrutiny. Within hours of their arrest, counter-terrorism officers raided homes across Greenwich, Romford, North London, and Lincolnshire, gathering hard drives, phones, and notes. They wanted to know, were these men acting alone, or was there a wider plan? Public anger grew quickly, not only toward the killers but toward the intelligence failures that allowed them to act. Why had men known to MI5 for years not been stopped? Why had Adebowale's online activity gone unnoticed? Parliament ordered an immediate review. In the weeks that followed, it became clear that both men had slipped through the cracks, watched, questioned, even flagged, yet ultimately dismissed as low risk. That misjudgment would haunt MI5 for years. The nation responds. As investigators built their case, London grieved. Thousands gathered in vigils across the country, holding candles and wearing Help for Heroes shirts, the same logo Lee Rigby wore that day. Flowers and letters covered the gates outside his barracks. The Royal Regiment of Fusiliers issued a statement calling Lee a soldier who stood for everything good about the British Army, honor, service, and strength. At the same time, community leaders across the UK called for calm. In the days following the murder, tensions flared and reports of hate crimes increased sharply. Yet across mosques, churches, and synagogues, a unified message echoed: violence does not speak for faith. A case that shook MI5 and the public alike. By the end of May, both Adebowale and Adebowale were discharged from the hospital and charged with murder. Their capture was only the beginning of a story that would expose the dangers of unchecked radicalization and the limits of modern intelligence work. For Lee Rigby's family, grief was mixed with disbelief. His mother spoke softly to reporters outside her home. He was a son, a father, a soldier, and he was taken from us on our own streets. All we want now is justice. But as the nation mourned, one question still lingered, one that would haunt the upcoming trial. Were these two men fanatics acting alone, or symptoms of something much larger? By the winter of 2013, the faces of Michael Adebowale and Michael Adebowale were known across the world. The footage from that May afternoon in Woolwich had become one of the most haunting images in British media history. Yet the courtroom at the Old Bailey was not a place for emotion. It was a place for truth. The trial began in late November 2013, 6 months after Lee Rigby's death. Security around the building was tight. Police patrolled every entrance, and journalists filled the corridors. The air was tense, heavy with anticipation. Every seat in the gallery was occupied by members of the public, reporters, and families, including Lee's mother, Lynn. When the defendants entered the courtroom, they showed no remorse. Dressed in plain clothing, they stood in the dock flanked by guards, their expressions unreadable. They pleaded not guilty, not because they denied their actions, but because they rejected the law that judged them. The trial begins. The prosecution, led by Richard Whittam KC, laid out a clear and detailed case. They showed that what happened on May 22, 2013 was not an act of war or a protest, it was cold-blooded murder. The courtroom was shown CCTV footage of the blue Vauxhall Tigris striking Lee as he crossed the road. Gasps filled the room, Lee's family left in tears. The prosecution described how the two men had used the car as a weapon, incapacitating him before carrying out the attack. Then came the evidence. Knives, a meat cleaver, and a rusted revolver found at the scene. Receipts proving the men had purchased the weapons and a sharpener the day before. Eyewitness testimony describing the men's calm demeanor as they waited for police to arrive. Their own recorded words on bystanders' phones, where they justified their actions and called on others to follow their cause. Whittam's voice was firm. This was not a battle. It was not an act of war. It was murder, deliberate, premeditated, and motivated by hatred. The defense's argument. Adebowale and Adebowale admitted everything. but they claimed they were not murderers in the criminal sense. They insisted they were soldiers in a war against Britain, fighting on behalf of Muslims abroad. Their defense argued that, because Lee was a member of the British Armed Forces, he was a legitimate target. The courtroom fell silent when Adebalejo took the stand. He spoke openly about his beliefs, calling himself a soldier of faith. He showed no sign of regret, describing the act as necessary. He told the jury he had expected to die that day, calling it a sacrifice. When asked if he felt sorry for Lee Rigby's family, his reply was chillingly simple. "It brings me no joy, but it brings me no shame." Psychiatrists examined both men. Adebalejo was found to be calm, lucid, and fully aware of his actions. Adebowale, however, was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. The court heard how he had suffered psychotic episodes, worsened by drug use and years of extremist indoctrination. Despite this, psychiatrists concluded that he understood what he was doing, and that his illness did not absolve him of responsibility. A courtroom of courage. Not every moment in the trial was dark. Amid the horror, stories of heroism shone through. Witnesses like Ingrid Lyo-Kennett, Amanda Donnelly, and Gemini Donnelly were publicly commended for their courage. The prosecutor called their actions a reminder that bravery exists even in the face of terror.